All right. If you're prepping for the SSC MTS exam, you really need to pay attention to this. The pattern is definitely changing. We're about to dive deep into the February 16th paper, and what we found suggests that just sticking to the old study methods might not cut it anymore. So let's get right into the analysis.
So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with that new exam pattern, then we'll look at actual questions from history, economy, culture, and science. And to wrap it all up, we'll distill everything into a super focused study guide for you.
You know, the single biggest takeaway from this whole exam is that the old rules, they might not apply anymore. The questions felt newer, a lot less predictable, and they're signaling a real shift away from just relying on past papers.
Yeah, this is a major heads up. What this really means is that just grinding out questions from previous years, well, that's a huge gamble now. Understanding the kinds of new questions they're asking has become absolutely essential for your prep.
Okay, so what does this new trend actually look like in practice? Let's start with the history section and see what the questions tell us about where the examiners are focusing.
First one up, we've got a question that ties a very specific, historically loaded term to a major figure. Any idea who coined the term Harijan?
And the answer? Well, it's Mahatma Gandhi. But listen, this isn't just some random trivia question. It's actually a huge clue about a much bigger theme in the exam.
Yeah, the analysis is screaming that Gandhi is a most important topic. This means you've got to go deep here. We're talking his movements, his writings, his entire role in the freedom struggle. A comprehensive review is definitely the way to go.
Okay, next question. This one's about a huge medieval battle, and you're going to need a very specific date for this.
Yep, 1192. But see, it's not just about the year. Knowing who is fighting Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad Ghori, that's the extra layer of detail they're clearly looking for now.
And here's a curveball, a much more modern history question, mixing in some corporate history with national policy. This one's pretty tricky for sure.
There you have it, January 24th, 1976. This is a perfect reminder that history on this exam doesn't just mean ancient India. Post-independence events are totally on the table.
All right, let's switch gears and talk economy, because this paper makes it crystal clear that big national milestones are a huge focus for the examiners.
So, this was the big one from the economy section, a major moment in India's recent story. Any guesses on the year?
The answer is 2014. But hold on, because this simple date points to a much bigger pattern in how they're thinking about these questions.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. They've asked about the 3 trillion mark before. Now they're asking about 2 trillion. You see the pattern? It's a massive hint that you should be ready for questions about the 1 trillion mark and, for sure, that future $5 trillion target.
Okay, let's talk culture, because this is where that whole new questions trend really explodes. It looks like they're tossing out some of the old, familiar folk dance questions for stuff that's way more specific and, honestly, a bit unpredictable. I mean, just look at this stuff. The Dosmoche Festival in Ladakh, a specific novel from 1939, the exact river next to the Ranakapur Jain Temple. A lot of people probably weren't expecting this level of detail.
So what's the bottom line? For the culture section, just studying past papers is a recipe for disaster. The message is loud and clear. Be prepared for anything and broaden your horizons on festivals, authors, and cultural sites.
Okay, on to science and tech. And this section was a really interesting mix, you know? It went from really basic concepts all the way to some super modern, cutting-edge AI.
So, on one side, you've got them going back to basics, like asking for the SI unit of work. On the other, a pretty standard biology question. This tells you that you absolutely cannot skip the fundamentals.
And then, bam, you get this, a question on WHAM, a brand new AI model from Microsoft. This is the perfect example of how they're pulling in current tech news. The takeaway here is super simple. You've got to keep up with what's happening in the world of big tech.
All right, so we've seen the patterns across history, economy, culture, and science. Let's pull all of this together into one solid, actionable game plan for your revision. So here it is, your new priority list. First, go deep on Mahatma Gandhi. Second, know those economic milestone years by heart. 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 5 trillion. Third, books and authors are showing up again and again. Don't forget those basic SI units in physics. And finally, for culture, you've got to think outside the box and study beyond the usual suspects. Look, the pattern is crystal clear. The questions are getting fresher and way more specific.
We've just given you a peek inside the minds of the people setting this exam. So really, the only question left is, what are you going to do to adapt your strategy and crush